Yeah, I know. That's why I said that's why I know.
That's outrageous.
Bang here. Good morning. The Subcommittee on the Interior, the Environment will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Before we get started, I did want to take a moment to speak directly to our audience. I want to thank the witnesses and also those members of the community who have chosen to be here. I do want to point out this is a formal hearing of the subcommittee and not a town hall meeting. We're here to hear from the witnesses. Though we value what the members of the public have to say, this is a formal hearing. If there's time afterwards, Ms. Plaskett and I will come to the back and visit and listen to anybody's concerns, but we also need to get back to Washington because we have votes tomorrow in the House. So we'd appreciate it if the members of the audience would basically just listen, and if you've got something to say, obviously you can write to us or we'll try to talk to you after. With that, I'll offer my opening statement before we get started. Today, the subcommittee will examine the effects of the historic 2017 hurricane season on the U.S. Virgin Islands. However, before we get started, I do want to thank the ranking member of this subcommittee, Ms. Plaskett, for being such a wonderful host and showing us our beautiful home islands. It's been almost 30 years since I've been here. There have been substantial changes, not just based on time, but obviously based on the devastation of the hurricane. These islands are extremely beautiful, but the effects of the hurricane are clear, and it's painful to see the destruction in this area. I'm especially sympathetic to what the residents of the USVI are enduring because my home city of Corpus Christi, Texas, was slammed by Hurricane Harvey as well this year. We faced wind gusts up to 132 miles an hour in nearby Port Aransas, an island community that I grew up in, having had a house there. I tell you, the devastation that we saw from Harvey, it reached as far as the Houston area based on rains. It was just amazing. According to the National Weather Service, Houston saw an all-time record daily rainfall accumulations on August 26th and 27th. The struggle that residents in Texas and in the Virgin Islands have faced in the aftermath of these storms has been intense. Economic losses based on Harvey are as high as $100 billion, and we're still awaiting numbers from here as we continue to do recovery. I bring up Texas to note that I do have experience with these devastating hurricanes, and I made my trip here particularly interesting, and it's personally important for me to understand the challenges that y'all are facing. Just earlier this week, I was in Port Aransas talking to the mayor about their recovery efforts, and we see some of the same challenges here with housing and debris removal, and there's an extra burden here based on logistics. It takes longer and it's more expensive to get stuff out of here, and the same is true, or get stuff here and get the debris out of here. So it's interesting to see. We're looking always to find ways to improve and reform the federal response to this. The Stafford Act, which is the law governing federal disaster assistance in the U.S., is intended to be flexible and leave a great deal of decision-making to the localities, the state, territorial, and local governments. In our federalist system of government, this is important because it preserves the sovereignty of the territory, states, and local governments and respects their expertise. However, these locations and localities often need federal assistance when faced with overwhelming disasters, as happened here and back home in Texas. This federal assistance is provided by an alphabet soup of agencies ranging from FEMA, DOD to HHS, SBA. I think it's important that Congress play a role in this as well, in particular this committee. We need to make sure these interactions, especially those between local governments and federal agencies, are working as well as possible. Now, by the very definition of the word, a disaster is disruptive. It causes chaos and upends the order of life that we're used to. And as such, there's always going to be difficulties coordinating the relief and recovery efforts, and geography just adds to some of those challenges. There are always ways we can improve this, and that's certainly the case here in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I hope today we can have a productive discussion about advancing these improvements. And I want to thank the representatives of the federal agencies who've taken time out of their busy schedules to appear today. I want to thank the participants of our panel representing the local perspective, because your voice is vital to understanding what we need to do to fix the disaster relief problem. I want to point out that even though it's just Ms. Plaskett and me here, we'd originally scheduled this meeting in December, but the House schedule changed, and the day we were planning on being here, it got changed, and as a result, some of the other members that were planning to attend were not able to reschedule to come at this date. But both Ms. Plaskett and I felt like it was important that we get this hearing done as soon as possible. This transcript will be made available to the entire subcommittee and committee as a whole. So I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say, and now I'll recognize Ms. Plaskett for her opening statement.
I first want to thank the Chairman Farenthold for calling this hearing to examine the impact of the federal government's response to Hurricanes Irma and Maria in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I also would like to thank the chairman of the committee, Trey Gowdy, who has made sure that this hearing was able to take place. I especially would like to thank the Senate President, Myron Jackson, as well as all of the members of the legislature for allowing us hosting us and having this hearing here in the Virgin Islands Legislative Building. I think people need to be aware that this is probably the only time that the U.S. House of Representatives has had a formal hearing here in the United States Virgin Islands. While there have been town halls, there have been meetings. This is, in fact, a record that will go into the congressional record and will demonstrate the people of the Virgin Islands' vigilance and resilience and their concerns as U.S. citizens for the effect of and the impact of the federal response on these islands. Every sector of the U.S. Virgin Islands was devastated by 2 Category 5 hurricanes, which made landfall last September. 85% of the homes were destroyed or damaged. 9 of the territory's K through 12 public schools remain shuttered due to damages sustained by the hurricanes. The University of the Virgin Islands suffered damage to its campuses on both St. Thomas and St. Croix. Both the Roy Lester Schneider Regional Medical Center in St. Thomas and the Governor Juan Francisco Louis Hospital on St. Croix sustained damage and could not perform critical care services, forcing the evacuation of critical care and chronic patients to Puerto Rico and eventually the U.S. mainland. Our airports and seaports remain closed for days. Roadways and thoroughfares already in disrepair sustained further damage, and critical communications, including radio broadcast antennas and cell towers, were crippled. Emergency 911 communications were inoperable. Hurricanes Irma and Maria caused dozens of injuries and some deaths. The damage from these storms and the psychological and long-term economic impact is as unparalleled as the occurrence of 2 Category 5 hurricanes making landfall in a specific area in a 2-week period could do. And while the federal government's response is welcomed and appreciated, there are critical improvements that must be made in advance of the next Atlantic hurricane season, which begins June 1, and the ones to follow, if we want to mitigate the loss of life, injury, and damage to property. To be clear, the people of the Virgin Islands of the United States are grateful for the efforts of the federal government in assisting our recovery. I'd like to make that point at the beginning. Through our combined recovery efforts, disaster and recovery centers received over 63,000 visits from hurricane survivors. Distribution centers provided approximately 100,000 meals and some 72,000 liters of drinking water. As of January, both FEMA and SBA have approved more than $400 million in grants and low-interest disaster housing loans and $68.7 million in aid to various individual and household programs. Congress has passed 3 disaster supplemental appropriations. Still, the recovery is far from over. The catastrophic destruction caused by Hurricanes Irma and Maria continue to demand massive amounts of aid to address the overwhelming needs of the victims who now face the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. We will hear about the things that went well, but we must also hear about the things that did not go as well and ways that we can improve ourselves. That is the sign of a true democracy and a mature country that is able to hear where our shortfalls were so that we can do better the next time. We must continually try to improve ourselves. That's how we remain the greatest country in the world. For one, the U.S. citizen, so some of the issues that we have found are the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services field offices in St. Croix remain closed. There are currently no office to process permanent residency and naturalization applications for persons without the means to travel to St. Thomas. And if they could travel to St. Thomas, these persons would need to wait an exorbitant amount of time for personnel to process the backlog of applications. The hardworking permanent residents and legal immigrants who continue to contribute to our economy cannot suffer any longer. Additionally, the United States Postal Service has released hundreds of workers hired to eliminate mail backlogs despite the continuing delays. Packages have been delayed for months at a time. I have specific cases that I've given to the Assistant Postmaster General regarding that. Mail has simply gone poof, disappeared in distribution centers in Puerto Rico. That cannot be. The United States Postal Service is a primary means of commerce in the territory, and that needs to be restored. The Army Corps of Engineers and Federal Emergency Management Agency, and working with the government of the Virgin Islands, has not completely provided adequate plans for plant and other hurricane debris removal. Mounds of hurricane debris, including appliances and scrap metal, are disposed of near public schools and pose real health and safety risk. Virgin Islanders are still struggling to achieve normalcy. We are now 80 days away from the 2018 hurricane season, 16 months away from the 2019 hurricane season, and 28 months away from the following. The only thing we are ready for is freedom from the longstanding problems caused by the last hurricane. Without adequate federal investment in infrastructure and other critical funding to harden systems like our energy grid to make them more resilient to withstand future storms, we will be in the same or worse predicament than we were following the last major storm, particularly with so many homes still exposed today. In the aftermath of the storms, I and Ranking Member Elijah Cummings wrote to Chairman Trey Gowdy in October to request a hearing on the federal recovery efforts in the Virgin Islands. We received several briefings from FEMA, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Defense. Today is our first public hearing on the hurricane's response, and I'm pleased that we are able to receive testimony from representatives of the Virgin Islands community and federal officials directly involved in the relief and recovery efforts. To better prepare ourselves for future hurricanes, I've worked with Congress to introduce H.R. 4782, the Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands Equitable Rebuild. This is the Marshall Plan we are requesting for the Virgin Islands. Additionally, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands allows the islands to use disaster funds to lay the groundwork for a more resilient and clean energy grid. I believe that is what Congress has been requesting. Both Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, as well as Democratic Whip Steny Hoyer, wrote an opinion piece together after coming to the Virgin Islands, who recognized that the Stafford Act must be amended to allow for resiliency and the hardening of our systems so that we can withstand the next hurricane season. Throughout this hearing, you will find that the Virgin Islands is resilient. Because of this resilience, she has come a far way since the previous hurricane season. However, normalcy remains out of the reach of far too many Virgin Island residents. And to stop it, the progress made is to impose on American citizens a substandard quality of life. Thank you again, Chairman, for having this hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and asking pertinent questions.
Thank you very much, and I'm now pleased to introduce our first panel of witnesses. Senator Myron D. Jackson, the Senate President of the United States Virgin Islands, and Senator, and I hope I get this pronounced right, Tregenza A. Roach. He's a senator from the Virgin Islands legislature as well. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Would you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect both witnesses answered in the affirmative. Y'all may be seated. We do have two panels today. In order to allow time for discussion, appreciate it if you'd limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As you see, there's a clock on the middle desk here that you may not be able to read the time, but it does have a green, yellow, and red light. Much like a traffic signal, green means go, yellow means hurry up, and red means stop. So we will start, I guess, with Senate President Jackson. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Honorable Blake Farron Hole, Chairman, and Honorable Stacy Plaskett, Delegate to the Virgin Islands and Ranking Member. Mr. Chairman, at this time I would ask your indulgence and ask if the Vice President of the institution can join me as we have been partners through the process of our recovery.
Without objection. So ordered.
Thank you. That would be Senator Nareda Rivera O'Reilly. It is a pleasure to host the Subcommittee on Interior, Energy, and Environment of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform today in the Earl B. Artley Legislative Chambers on St. Thomas. On behalf of the 32nd Legislature of the Virgin Islands, we are grateful for the opportunity to testify before you today and this field hearing to assess the impacts of the 2017 hurricane season on the Virgin Islands of the United States. The double blow of two Category 5 storms, Hurricanes Irma and Maria, to our territory had a crippling effect on our territory, from which we are still in turmoil in areas such as healthcare, schools, emergency services, housing, our electrical system, agriculture and environment, and our cultural heritage and tourism industry. Without the assistance of the U.S. government, federal funds infused into our economy, and the hundreds of men and women sent to assist the Virgin Islands, we could not be where we are on the journey to recovery. Thank you to the Federal Emergency Management Agency and all the linemen, engineers, national emergency workers who have expended countless hours to work with our local officials, first responders, local and national military forces, volunteer groups, and others in the restoration from the devastating natural disasters we experienced last September. As it relates to our Federal Disaster Assistance Community Disaster Loan, the Virgin Islands is grateful for the financial assistance approved by Congress in October of 2017 in the form of $500 million in low-interest community disaster loan from FEMA, which will cover revenues lost and support the territory's hospitals, central government operations, and water and power authority over the course of the next 3 fiscal years. We are also grateful that Congress approved the $89 billion to areas impacted by natural disasters to include the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. It is calculated that the Virgin Islands may ultimately receive in excess of $7.5 billion requested for our recovery. We ask you also to be our voice as advocates in forgiveness of these loans so that the territory can fully recover and continue to advance economically, as efforts were being made prior to the arrival of these storms. The most glaring casualty, of course, for us is the medical evacuees. The 2017 hurricane season has been very impactful to our health system. The territory as a whole was adversely impacted as we airlifted patients out of the territory. Over 500 patients were transported out of the Virgin Islands, and close to 140 remain on the mainland. As of last month, according to the Commission of Health, 43 evacuees have died. Under the current response plan, FEMA, the Department of Health, Human Services, the Department of Defense, all have responsibilities for medical evacuees. Hurricane Irma and Maria exposed the chaotic management of our most vulnerable citizens. This is a time that we need to consolidate the responsibility for our medical evacuees under one agency. That agency must keep a chain of command of each patient, including the names of the accompanying family member and an additional emergency contact. We cannot allow evacuees to be further stressed by this uncertainty. We must and can do better for our citizens as they are forced to leave their homes to seek medical services during disasters. Another area of concern is housing. A primary concern for the territory in the wake of the hurricanes was a response to our displaced residents. A prime example of this is the Department of Housing and Urban Development on February 2nd, 2018, announced it would afford the territory $243 million to help the Virgin Islands recover from the effects of the storm. The devastating picture of the Tutu high-rise and Lagoon Street communities could paint no clearer image of the destruction to hundreds of homes that were ripped open. No immediate emergency housing was provided for residents living in the devastated areas, such as the Tutu high-rise and residential communities within the territory. In the immediate aftermath of storms, temporary housing is needed on the ground. Other areas of concern is our schools. The overriding concerns in the area of education is the split sessions of many of our schools in the territory. In retrospect, we could have done better in collaboration with FEMA. I recognize that my time has ended, and I'm available to answer any questions the committee deems necessary. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and we do have your we do have your testimony. I read it beforehand, and I appreciate it. Senator Roach, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Farrenhall. Good morning, Delegate Plaskett, to your staff, to the people of the Virgin Islands. My name is Tregenza A. Roach, a member of the 32nd Legislature of the United States Virgin Islands. This is my third term. Despite my office, however, I would like to speak to you as a private person, a resident who experienced both Hurricanes Irma and Maria firsthand, as a person who had to navigate the recovery process for my aging mother, whose home sustained substantial damage, and as a person who helped others navigate, which has been an arduous recovery process. Secondly, I would like to share my thoughts as a policymaker, especially in light of the fact that a new hurricane season starts in June, and in light of the information provided by many of those who study the changes in the world's climate and warn that more storms like these are in our future, more fierce and damaging than those we have experienced before. My mother is an 82-year-old widow who has her faculties. She tills the soil and harvests everything from pumpkin to guava berry. That is to say that despite some of the maladies that accompany aging, she is a fit and active woman. But for the first time in a hurricane season, I had to get her off the island for her own sanity and for mine, and was then left to take charge of dealing with FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Small Business Administration, insurance companies, banks. Immediately after Hurricane Irma, I was on a hunt for a tarpaulin to cover the leaking roof. None was available up to the coming of Hurricane Maria on September 19, 2018. I was able to secure covering for the leaking roof only because a colleague, Senator Alicia Chucky Hansen, was able to purchase a tarpaulin commercially and bring it over on a Mercy flight from St. Croix before they were hit with Hurricane Maria. I paid 3 men to go on the roof and put the tarp in place, but Maria came and pretty much disposed of it. Weeks after, the Army Corps of Engineers came on the scene and covered the roof with blue. The tarpaulin has leaked since then, despite follow-up visits from the Corps and a local contractor who they identified to the project. I simply gave up. Virgin Islanders are not begging people, so I, like others, simply gave up and deployed pots and pans at strategic places on the floor to capture the flow. As for FEMA, they subsequently sent an inspector who I thought was very thorough in verifying the damage. They inquired about insurance. I told them there was a policy, but no content and limited structural. But their denial letter followed and a check of $500. I visited their center, sat with everyone else, provided proof of limits on insurance, and then received my second denial letter. I can appeal when I finally settle with the insurance company, which has not yet taken place. The letters have been terse with no consideration for the recipient. The SBA project was initiated in October. The denial was also swift in coming. This is an aging population, both nationally and locally, and so I find it instructive to look at the impact of the processes on the elderly. On the many calls that I receive from the elderly, I want to tell you of another which illustrates the insensitivity of the process to wounded persons seeking only the assistance of their government. Another 82-year-old came to my office, a woman, with her 2 denial letters. FEMA denied her assistance because she could not prove that she owned the property in which she lived, and SBA because she could not prove that the property in which she lived was her primary residence. This is the case of a woman who had moved into the house owned by her father. She had continued to live in the house after taking care of him for 17 years up to his death. I contacted FEMA and posed the question of whether the woman could simply get a power of attorney from the 4 siblings confirming that they were all part owners of the property, as per the will, that she lived in the property to take care of her father, and that she continued to live there with their consent and was authorized to access the recovery project on her behalf. The FEMA officials to whom I spoke said yes, but no one at any of the centers had shared this possibility with this aging, tired, wounded woman. She was on her own. As a policymaker, I think we must address the following: a more effective and timely process by the Army Corps of Engineers with roof coverings after a storm, a permanent FEMA presence in the territory, owing to the fact that this is to become our new reality, and that a permanent presence would mean a more efficient experience, particularly for our sister island of St. John, who can be cut off totally, power and communication, with the loss of a cable from St. Thomas. A federal approach to recovery, which considers the whole person who suffer mental health issues following a storm, and a process which is more timely. I thank you for listening to my testimony, and await any questions that you may have.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll start with you. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. So, Senator Roach, I want to first point out that I understand the issues with FEMA, having dealt with this from a constituent issue as well. I've spoken to FEMA numerous times and have volunteered to rewrite their letters for them, because typically a denial letter from FEMA is not a denial letter. It's there's something wrong with your file, and it needs to not say denial right there up in the top in big lettering. It needs to. It definitely does need to be more compassionate. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about housing. You've got a unique situation in the Virgin Islands with respect to housing. In the district I represent, we have hundreds of people living in temporary housing in hotels. But a vast majority of the hotels in the Virgin Islands are unoccupied, and filling those hotel rooms with local residents takes away from the ability of other local residents to make money off of tourists. How would, if you were president, or if you were the head of FEMA, what would you do to address the short-term housing need? It's my understanding we still have people in the Virgin Islands living in tents.
Well, I think I would offer a two-pronged approach. I remember in the aftermath of Hurricane Marilyn that there were temporary structures that were erected. I can recall at least 2 places on the island of St. Thomas, one on the east and one just adjacent to the Charlotte Amalia High School, which provided temporary housing. I think the other consideration would be how to make damaged homes more livable. The second part of my testimony, which I didn't read, which is what you have for the record, was a new program, at least new to the extent that I was made aware of it, on approximately the 10th of February. And that is a program that is being conducted under the auspices of the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority, and it is intended to make living spaces more habitable. And so I applied for that program on the 14th of February, I know because it was Valentine's Day. They subsequently sent out an inspector who I believe, actually a team of inspectors who were very thorough. I mean, they asked questions about whether there was hot water to the property. They asked questions whether there was any damage to the gas lines bringing gas into the kitchen. They asked if there was a working refrigerator. They asked about smoke detectors. They asked about whether the system had been cleaned, etc. But then the follow-up visit, I just found out on Saturday, they just passed the 10th of March, that they're now coming again to the property with an inspector. Now, although it seems to me that it's a very thorough program, we're looking again. I initiated my FEMA application on the 14th of September. I was one of those few people who had internet access, and I did the application online. The 14th of September. This is the 12th of March. And except for the leaking top, except for the $500 from FEMA, I think that sums up about the assistance. And I think the making the space more livable would be incredibly good for the mental health of the person, one, and two, particularly, and I always want to emphasize the elderly, particularly in the instances of the elderly, if they could stay in their home with just some accommodations to make it more livable, I think they would be in a better condition to complete the recovery process.
Thank you. Senator Jackson, we've heard a little bit about insurance as well and how long it's taking for the insurance company to pay. In Texas, the vast majority of hurricane system insurance is handled by TWIA, which is a state-operated insurance program. And believe me, we've had plenty of complaints about that. I'm glad I'm not in the Texas legislature. I only have to deal with FEMA, not TWIA. What in the Virgin Islands, can you talk a little bit about the experience of collecting insurance, and if there's anything you think either the state or the territorial or federal government ought to do to improve that?
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. The issues relating to insurance in the territory has been one of contention. Many of the homeowners have expressed their displeasure in the manner to which their insurance companies have taken them through the process of their adjusters, and likewise the time that it took for the adjuster to arrive at their homes. In addition to that, the issue of underinsurance continues to be a big issue here in the territory. Of course, education is key, and through banking and insurance, and several of the forums prior to the storm, encouraging our residents to be much more educated in the process to which they purchase insurance, and likewise what underinsurance would mean in the event of a devastating hurricane or disaster. And for the most part, most residents here have windstorm insurance coverage. Very little have flood insurance. So as a result of the challenges that many have had with our insurance companies, we have had an engagement with banking and insurance in reference to how we can improve the process here in the territory and likewise protect the interests of the consumer as they are purchasing insurance through these companies, and likewise the fine line that many may not read in reference to the coverage, and likewise make informed decisions. Likewise, the banking community also has a responsibility to make sure that their customers are also fully aware of the process to which the banks and the customer have a relationship with coverage for their homes in the territory.
Now, I see my time is up. Hopefully we'll have time to do one more round of questions, because I do have some questions, but I do want to let Ms. Plaskett. I do have one quick question, though. It's kind of yes or no. The flood insurance here is the same as in the continental United States, right? It's underwritten by FEMA? Okay.
That is my understanding.
In FIP?
Yeah.
All right. Ms. Plaskett, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I did, Mr. Chairman, want you to know, however, that it's my understanding for most homeowners here, what the insurance that they need would be, in fact, windstorm insurance. which for many homeowners can run over $1,000 a month.
Trust me, I live in a hurricane-prone area.
Right. So that's
I live
that's
that
the
as well.
concern.
Yep.
Thank you so much for being here. And Senator Jackson, so much of your testimony that you were not able to give that is written testimony is very informative, and I'm sure that the committee will have a chance to read through much of it. So the questions that I'm going to ask are directly related to your statements so that you can get that information on the record as well. I wanted to ask you, Senator Jackson, about debris removal. And if you could, or Senator O'Reilly, talk about the difference between the debris removal on St. Thomas, which was run by the Army Corps, managed by the Army Corps, and St. Croix, which was managed by the Department of Public Works, which I understand. Could you tell us about how that process has occurred here in the Virgin Islands?
Okay, I'll leave Senator O'Reilly speak to St. Croix. I'll speak to St. Thomas, and that for many of us, it's been very frustrating with the process of debris removal from our neighborhoods, highways, and the like. And I would say that the early process to how we get to clean up our communities has been one of contention. And I say contention in that many of the areas of our communities still have debris. And we visited St. John yesterday in the East End, and I was aghast of the amount of debris that is still on the roadsides, in addition to utility wiring and some of the remnants of our electrical poles and the like that are littered on the side of our roads. The Army Corps of Engineers, in collaboration with the Department of Public Works, and of course the company Series, has been engaged in this district, and of course through the process of public announcements, which I feel in many ways have not been very successful, because if you don't listen to a particular radio program, you may not know the schedule coming into your neighborhood and the like. So there needed to be more underground communications with residents in terms of when do you put out your green waste, when do you put out your electronic waste and other items. And in some cases, residents have had to really struggle, especially our elderly, in getting that waste to the curbside in many of our neighborhoods, which has been very challenging for many of our residents, especially our elderly.
Can I ask, when did you first see federal agencies on the ground doing waste removal, debris removal? Can you recall?
Well, I said to you that right after the storm, the Department of Public Works was mobilized. In addition to that, we had the military on the ground. Those are, and other emergency entities like what we have here in terms of the response to.
Do you know when that was? Because as I recall, for quite a number of weeks, it was Public Works, yes, the local Public Works, and residents who were doing much of the debris
Much
removal.
of the debris removal began with the residents of the territory. Public Works started to deal with the main thoroughfares, but within our residential communities, they were challenged with the lack of assistance in getting out of their respective neighborhoods and into the main thoroughfares of our roadway system.
Thank you. Senator O'Reilly, you have spent an enormous amount of time in the hospitals and dealing with the issues there. Is there anything that you would like to share with the committee about the evacuation, the hospital process, or anything you'd like to add at this point?
I would, and good morning, Mr. Chairman Farrenhold and Ms. Plaskett. With the few seconds left, I'd like to
You can
share.
take more than a second.
Thank you. I'd like to share since the President already mentioned the concerns regarding the medical evacuees, I'd like to share specifically regarding the structures of the hospitals. It is my opinion as the chair of the Committee on Health, Hospitals and Human Services that the assessment by FEMA of the structures is too slow, that the change in personnel by FEMA has delayed the final assessment of the structures. Now, the assessment has to establish that the repairs would cost 50 or more percent in order for a new structure to be built. As of today, we still do not know whether we will have new hospitals. In the interim, individuals are flown out of the territory on a daily basis to receive medical care. I think it is unacceptable that a federal agency that is trained to respond to disasters such as FEMA has taken this long to make a final determination regarding the status and the condition and the future of our healthcare structures, infrastructures, and our healthcare services.
Thank you.
All right, we'll do a second round of questions because I've probably got enough to keep us here all day. But let's visit for a second, and I'll ask each of our panel members if you would tell us what, with respect to the federal response, if you would give us what you think the best they've done is and the worst, or a suggestion for improvement where we need to focus primarily on improvement. Because I'm one of these people who believes if you're going to criticize something, you also need to say something good or have a suggestion for fixing it. So I'll give each of our folks a chance to do that. Senator Roach, senator's an ambiguous term here, I guess.
Well, I would echo the delegate in recognizing that the assistance provided by the federal government is valuable and useful, and that the people who came to assist with the process are people who left their homes and their families to come here and spend time with us in a very difficult moment. And so I think we definitely would have to be appreciative of that. I think one of the programs that I got the least complaints about was the food, the SNAP emergency disaster funding. But as a thought on how we could improve going forward, I really believe that the people involved in the process have to be more sensitive to what we are experiencing here, and to be mindful of the fact that we are living in a place that is going to be exposed to more of these storms. We're living in a place that has, if not the highest, certainly one of the highest costs of living under the United States flag, and that construction costs and food costs are not what they imagine them to be. And if they approach it with that kind of information and with that sensitivity, I think the process can be improved for everyone.
All right. Senator Jackson, you want to take the same question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Senator Roach stated in reference to the aid that the FEMA disaster has provided to the territory and their response to the territory, we are grateful. I think the areas that I would like to see improved is that how do you deal with territories during a natural disaster? Of course, we're separated by water by thousands of miles. The protocols that were put in place, for example, for the storage of emergency goods in Puerto Rico, we can all say that that's a failure. And that likewise the Virgin Islands was impacted by these two hurricanes, and that Puerto Rico also was severely impacted, and that the ability to provision the U.S. Virgin Islands became even more so challenging. In areas, for example, hurricane zone like the Virgin Islands or the Caribbean, but specifically to the Virgin Islands, the loss of roofing material is going to be the greatest impact that you would have from storms and infrastructure. And the issues relating to not having available tops in the territory to sufficiently cover our people during these storms are is an area that we should improve in terms of how do we take care of the population. One of the areas also was food security. Many of the meals ready to eat coming into the ground is understandable as you address the immediate recovery or response to the community. But then at the same time, who makes those decisions in terms of what meals, whether they're culturally sensitive? So the Red Cross stepped up to the place, as well as individuals like Tim Duncan that provided wholesome meals to our community versus meals ready to eat and snacks in boxes. So the nutritional health of our community is really very important. And I think those were areas that FEMA could do better in, and likewise the response on the ground in getting the professionals into the territory. For example, we've been advocating for the impact of cultural resources, and only most recently professionals have come into the territory to assist entities in this regard of our cultural institutions, our libraries, our museums, cultural heritage sites, and the like. And those are just some examples that I provide to you, Mr. Chairman, that we could do improvement in.
And Senator Rivera O'Reilly, do you want to take a stab at that one as well?
I'd like to. Thank you so very much. I think that shelter, water, and food are essential in the immediate response. We felt very comforted by the presence of the military, and we are so thankful. As soon as military trucks were on the ground, in collaboration with our National Guard, it gave our citizens a sense that they were being taken care of. There were truckloads moving across the islands filled with water and MREs, and I am so grateful. I am so grateful for that. There are a number of areas that I believe can be improved. I urge you to consider the increase in the reimbursement rates under CMS for Medicare and Medicaid. It will help our hospitals significantly to remain operational. I also urge you to look at the manner in which the Army Corps of Engineers rolls out their Blue Roof program. It is designed for stateside housing, for stateside roofs, not Caribbean construction. And so when they came out and installed the blue roofs, what they did was cause greater damage to the roofs. So where there was one leak after the blue roof was installed and residents expected there would be no leak, there were multiple leaks. I also would like to recommend that when FEMA comes to the ground, that it comes with its own pods, that it brings its own shelters, because they have saturated the remaining hotel rooms in the territory. What that did was that it inhibited and it impeded adjusters from coming to the territory because there was no housing. So all of your federal personnel completely saturate the remaining hotel rooms, also limiting hotel rooms for the tourist. I will also ask that you consider including the Virgin Islands in the Denton Act. It turns out that we are not. So military airplanes cannot be utilized to move humanitarian aid to our Virgin Islands after disasters. We need to be able to use your military planes so that individuals in the mainland who want to send supplies are able to do so. Those would be my requests. Of course, if you allow me more time, I'll say that FEMA should, as well as SBA, consider including non-English proficient individuals in the teams that they send to the territory. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I thought FEMA did that. We got a lot of Spanish speakers down in our area, but I'll certainly look into that.
They didn't hear
as well. All right, Ms. Plaskett, we'll let you do, and then we'll finish this round of questioning and go into our federal panel.
I wanted to ask if I have three written testimonies that I'd like to include in the record. One is from Virginia Claremont with Clean Sweep Frederickstead. The other is presented by Mrs. Ruby Simmons Isanison here on St. Thomas. And then the third is by Senator Janelle Sorrow Senator in the 32nd legislature.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And before I ask the questions, there was just a couple of pieces in this testimony that I wanted to give on the record before I ask these questions. One, of course, is a very moving testimony and statement that was given by Ms. Simmons-Isanison, talking about the evacuees, which has been discussed by the witnesses here this morning by the senators. She says, in the State of the Territory address presented on January 22nd, 2018, Governor Kenneth E. Mapp noted that 682 persons were evacuated for medical reasons, and some 248 still remain on the mainland at that time. Since then, I have asked, what happened to the other 434 persons? How many of them came home in the cargo section of the plane? I can tell you specifically about the ones I know of, including my son-in-law, the aunts of two of my stepdaughters, a very dear friend, and the relatives of other persons with whom I've spoken or whose stories have been reported in the news. There are so many people that we lost during these hurricanes, but she gives specifically the names of Sergeant Aaron Hodge Sr., Ashley Frett Sr., Cynthia Thomas, Arroyo Carrera Rivera, and Elmarina Palmer, all of whom died after the hurricanes in the states as medical evacuees. And I think that's important for us to remember that the effects of hurricanes here in the Virgin Islands continued well after the actual hurricane took place. And one of the things that she points out that I'd like to then present a question to the witnesses is that she talks about going to VITEMA, which is the Virgin Islands Territorial Emergency Management Agency, seeking information about where individuals were after leaving the hospital. Were they in Puerto Rico? Were they in St. Croix? Where were they located? And for quite a period of time, many individuals could not be found. And she says she was able to find out from Sergeant Hodge that when he was in Puerto Rico, the situation that he faced there was really not a very good one. When he was in Puerto Rico, she quotes, I'm quoting, he told me that drinking water was being rationed. He was being given water in a container the size of a small fruit cup. That's about 3 ounces. This is what was given to a full-grown adult. He was eventually evacuated to Atlanta, Georgia, where unfortunately he passed away. I would like to ask the senators these questions, and Senator Osaro also talks about the situation on St. John, probably being more dire than the situation on the other islands. And she talks about the distribution sites, which Senator O'Reilly also gave some indication about how important they were. And my question to you all really relates to the relationship and the amount of communication and the coordination between the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the local one. Knowing that we are dealing with 2 Category 5 hurricanes and that our own resources are very restrained, FEMA has been at this for innumerable years. Do you feel that there was sufficient support coming from FEMA to pick up the gaps initially, knowing where there were things, or was in fact, how did that work? Was that done correctly? Are there ways that it could be improved, the coordination between FEMA and the local agencies that are in place? How can we work on that better? Senator Jackson?
It's a very good question, and we spent a tremendous amount of time in the EOC in VITEMA and had the opportunity to actually witness and to be engaged with the process of response. And I have to say, on both sides, we need to work on the response from a natural disaster in the territory. I think given the fact that we are islands, we're outside of the continental United States, and that likewise FEMA's history in the territory, of course, Hurricane Hugo and Hurricane Marilyn gave the territory some experience as it relates to FEMA and what is necessary for emergency response. And who would imagine that the Virgin Islands in its centennial year would be struck with two Category 5 hurricanes 12 days apart? Who prepares for that? And how does an emergency entity like VITEMA with limited resources really rise to the occasion of responding to the disaster? They themselves were not fully prepared. And that likewise, FEMA representatives coming into the territory with the lack of communications, driving around this territory, most time lost, not having a local scout or representative with them as they were going into these various neighborhoods, was very challenging. And I do think that we really need to revisit how FEMA and the territory protocols are put in place for a response in light of these two hurricanes, and likewise, most recently, the tsunami notification to the territory that created panic to our residents. We need to be prepared, fully prepared, and likewise how our relationship with the federal government hitting the ground is to be done, because it was very chaotic.
Did anyone else want to add something to that?
I'd like to, Congresswoman Plaskett, I believe that we should consider training a cadre of local residents who are now currently working with FEMA. Train them so that they too are able to be deployed to other areas in the United States that are hit. And so that when, not if, but when this territory is again victim of a disaster, that those FEMA trained local residents are deployed here because they are more familiar with the territory. I also felt that FEMA took a back seat and allowed VITEMA to take the lead. I am not sure, and I know that that is the protocol. I know that we are in charge, but I'm not sure that we can be in charge of solving our own disasters when our own homes are affected.
When you're in the middle of it yourself.
Yes. If you are in the middle of the disaster, it is difficult to really see. And so FEMA would take a step back and allow the local government to make the decisions. And I would prefer to see a real partnership, a side-by-side relationship where best practices are recommended to the local government so that VITEMA is empowered, because it had to respond to disasters on all 4 islands.
Thank you. I know that I had heated and very colorful discussions with Brock Long because FEMA, of course, we know in the federal government, only gives what is requested. But if you don't know what to request, and you are dealing with the magnitude of disaster, it's difficult to make those kind of assessments on the ground. And there needs to be, we end up hiring companies to assist us in making the request. There should be natural liaison and working with FEMA it's kind of like they're almost hiding the money or hiding the ball, and you have to figure out which hand it's in to ask the right thing. So thank you. And I know that that's also frustrating for the FEMA workers who are here on the ground, who want to do the right thing, who have empathy and want to be a part of the recovery, but they have to wait from what the okays that they're getting in Washington. And if you would, Senator Roach.
Thank you, Delegate Plaskett. I think we have to consider the need for adjustment of policies and processes both locally and federally. In our case, we have a statute that gives the governor complete authority to deal with the federal structures in a state of emergency. He's a point person for FEMA. He gets to determine whether a state of emergency should be extended and to what the length of time that can be renewed. And I think we ought to look at that structure. I think if the reality of the persons living offshore the United States, and in particular the residents of the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, that it is time to also consider new structures. And I believe that FEMA should have a permanent presence in the territory, that they should literally be here year-round, and I believe that that would assist in having better relationships with them and the local agencies that would lead to a more timely response in the case of natural disasters, and that we are living in extraordinary times that call for extraordinary solutions that we might not have considered before. Thank you.
And I know we're finishing this, but I would like to also place into the record another testimony, written testimony, a statement for the record that was given to me by Megan Enright. She is a resident of St. John and has been working with Love City Strong and Love for Love City Foundation on the recovery efforts in St. John.
Without objection, so ordered. And I'd like to thank our panel for being here and answering our questions and providing both the written and verbal testimony. We could go on like this, but we do have a panel of federal folks that we would like to talk to as well. So again, thank you all for being here. It's been great visiting your island. In order to allow us time to set up for the next panel, we're going to take a 5-minute recess. All right, if everybody will take their seats, we'll get started on panel number 2. I'm going to introduce them first. The subcommittee will come to order. I love the big gavel. It's like twice the size of the one we use in Washington.
You don't need a gavel that big.
Oh, my goodness. All right. We've got a new panel of witnesses. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce them. First, we have Mr. William Bill Vogel. He's the Federal Coordinating Officer at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, a.k.a. FEMA. We have Mr. Murad Mojo Rahim, ASPR Regional Emergency Coordinator for Region 2 at the Department of Health and Human Services. Welcome. We have Colonel Scott Heinzelman, Defense Coordinating Officer for FEMA Region 2 at the Department of Defense. We have Colonel Robert J. Clark, Commander of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Field Recovery Officer, or Office. Mr. Randy Lavasser, Caribbean Group Superintendent for the National Park Service. And we have Mr. Henry Hank Danka. He's the Manager of In-Plant Support for the Northeast Area of Operations for the United States Postal Service. Welcome, gentlemen. And pursuant to committee rules, we ask that you stand and be sworn in. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Y'all may be seated. Let the record reflect all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I believe all of y'all were in the audience for our first panel. Same basic rules apply. We've got your entire written testimony, and we ask that you give a synopsis within 5 minutes. Hit the high points, and as I said, yellow light means we're just about done. Red light means wrap it up. So we'll start first with Mr. Vogel, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning, Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Plaskett. My name is William Vogel, the Federal Coordinating Officer, and I'm here to testify about the critical role that FEMA has played in the U.S. Virgin Islands over the past 6 months. The U.S. Virgin Islanders were making progress after the devastation of Hurricane Irma in September, when then just 2 weeks later, a second Category 5 storm struck the territory. And in the months since Hurricane Maria, a large-scale coordinated effort has been underway to help the island communities and survivors get back on their feet. FEMA and our federal partners are working with the U.S. Virgin Islands government to drive recovery forward, to meet the needs of hurricane survivors, and to repair and rebuild communities stronger and safer to lessen the impact when storms strike in the future. FEMA coordinates the federal response to a disaster, and in the U.S. Virgin Islands, we mission assigned 55 other federal agencies to assist in response and recovery. These agencies responded immediately and deployed personnel to the territory along with the Department of Homeland Security Surge Capacity Force and FEMA. Within 2 weeks of Maria, 2,500 federal employees had deployed to the U.S. Virgin Islands, in addition to 6,000 Coast Guard and Department of Defense staff serving both the U.S. VI and Puerto Rico. All told, we issued 331 mission assignments totaling $698 million. And in 6 months, important recovery milestones have been achieved. Roads have been cleared of storm-related debris, commercial airline flights have resumed, seaports are active, and stores and restaurants have opened. I'm pleased to note that the Virgin Islands Water and Power Authority reports that power has been restored to all customers able to receive electrical hookups in the territory, more than 55,000 customers. Through FEMA's individual assistance and public assistance programs, low-interest disaster loans from the U.S. Small Business Administration, and claims payments by the National Flood Insurance Program, more than $810 million has been provided to households, businesses, and territorial agencies as a result of Irma and Maria. As of 9th of March, more than $74 million has been provided directly to individuals and households for rental assistance, housing repairs, and other needs. Housing is a priority for us because so many homes were damaged and there are few rental resources available. There is no standard solution for survivors. Each person's situation is very unique. We are very much aware that people are living with friends and relatives, creating very difficult living conditions. and I can tell you that I have spoken personally to people who are desperate for housing on the islands. We have several programs that are helping. We provide grants for home repair. We provide rental assistance. We are funding territorial programs called the Emergency Home Repair VI to provide money for people to make basic emergency repairs so that they can stay in their home while they work on a long-term solution. The funding comes from FEMA's Sheltering and Temporary Essential Power Program. We have the Multifamily Lease and Repair Program to pay for repair to rental units if the landlord will let us place disaster survivors in those units. We have a direct lease program in which we lease rental units and place survivors in them. We also have approved permanent housing construction direct repairs so that we can hire contractors to make essential repairs in lieu of providing other financial assistance. We've operated a total of 10 disaster recovery centers across all 3 islands to help answer questions related to these assistance programs and survivor-specific housing needs. These centers received more than 65,000 visits. We completed all housing inspections, and we're reaching out to individual survivors who have special housing needs. The housing side of recovery is never a simple process, but for a territory that spans several islands where housing resources are scarce, the challenges are multiplied. We are looking for every possible way to support survivors who need housing. This is my #1 priority. Installing temporary facilities for critical infrastructure is also a top priority. FEMA's Public Assistance Program staff is working closely with the Virgin Islands Department of Health and Education to construct interim facilities for medical and hospitals and schools that were damaged. FEMA is also working with our federal and local partners on cost estimates for permanent repairs to those critical facilities and other public infrastructure. To date, we have reimbursed the territory $262.5 million for emergency work, mostly for debris removal and other power restoration. At the outset, it was important to get electrical power restored and remove debris from roadways. I can report that working with the Army Corps of Engineers and the territorial agencies, we have moved 887,000 cubic yards of debris left by the storms, 102% of the total estimated debris beginning at the operation. FEMA has authorized 100% cost share for debris removal. Nearly 800 power company workers deployed to the islands to restore power. Students were able to return to school within weeks after the hurricanes because of the generators installed by the Army Corps of Engineers. In all, the Army Corps installed 180 generators in critical facilities such as schools, hospitals, emergency services, government agencies, and other places, enabling communities to continue functioning after the storms. It's been a big operation, particularly with the logistics challenges involved in providing assistance to the island communities. We are deeply aware of the stress that these hurricanes have placed on the population and the territorial government. We will continue to support the territory's priorities, and we will be on the job until the territory tells us when we've completed our work. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rahim, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Farrenholt and Ranking Member Plaskett. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, ASPR, to discuss our nation's medical and public health response and recovery efforts to the hurricanes that impacted Puerto Rico and the United States Virgin Islands, USVI. I'm Murad Rahim, the Regional Administrator for Region 2 within ASPR. The scale and scope of this year's hurricane season was unprecedented. Never before has our response system been tested to support the impact of 3 major storm systems within such a short period. While the National Disaster Medical System, NDMS, was supporting the response following landfall of Hurricane Harvey in Texas, the system had to mobilize in Florida, Puerto Rico, and the USVI to support Hurricane Irma. Then, within days, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico and the USVI, impacting many of the same communities. Despite the challenges, ASPR provided professional and trained personnel and resources to mitigate the impact of the storms, ultimately saving lives. When ASPR was originally established by Congress a decade ago, the objective was to create unity of command by consolidating all federal public health and medical preparedness and response functions under ASPR. ASPR leads the federal public health and medical preparedness, response, and recovery to disasters and public health emergencies in accordance with the National Response Framework and Emergency Support Function Number 8, Public Health and Medical Support. ASPR also coordinates with other components of HHS with respect to HHS's role in ESF Number 6, which is Health and Social Services, and HHS's lead role as the coordinating agency with respect to the Health and Social Services Recovery Support Function. ASPR is, in effect, the National Security Mission Manager for HHS. Specific to my role within ASPR, as the RA in Region 2, I work to build and maintain relationships with state, local, territorial, and tribal officials and healthcare representatives daily. These established relationships proved critical during their immediate preparedness for and response to Hurricane Irma and Maria. Given my daily coordination and communication with officials before the hurricanes hit, I was familiar with local resources and, as such, was able to ensure the federal response to local needs. Since late October, I've also served as a federal health coordinating official. In this role, I'm the primary point of contact supporting information flow between HHS and local officials. Specific to the response provided following Hurricanes Irma and Maria, ASPR's strategy has been threefold: save lives, stabilize the healthcare system, and restore services. To save lives and stabilize the healthcare system, approximately 2,500 NDMS personnel were deployed to the impacted area and were supported by approximately 21.5 tons of equipment. While deployed, personnel provided care to over 2,500 patients in the USVI specifically. Care included providing access to trained medical assessments, treating minor injuries, dispensing medicine and water, wound care, and assessing injuries. When care exceeded capabilities, NDMS supported the evacuation of patients. We evacuated approximately 211 dialysis patients from the USVI before, between, and after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Our partners from the DoD and the Department of Veterans Affairs were key components of these moves. Once the hurricanes passed, teams provided on-site medical care through federal medical stations, with 50 to 250 beds provided through the Strategic National Stockpile. HHS also activated the Emergency Prescription Assistance Program, known as EPAP, for both the USVI and Puerto Rico to ensure victims who were unable to pay for prescriptions received required medication. Ensuring that people are still able to access these supplies that they rely on every day helps patients cope with the disaster more effectively and prevents stress on the healthcare system. Now that much of the response effort is concluding, ASPR is continuing to support the USVI through its recovery operations. Currently, HHS personnel are deployed long-term under the authorities of the National Disaster Response Framework and are in continual coordination with local officials to maintain situational awareness, link local officials to resources, and assist with challenges or issues as they arise. Our primary mission is to support a locally led recovery by building capacity with the USVI government and other key stakeholders that carry out the critical health and social services to the island's residents. In conclusion, the devastation caused by Hurricanes Irma and Maria overwhelmed local, state, and territorial healthcare capabilities. ASPR provided the resources to meet existing medical requirements, transported patients to ensure proper care when needed, utilized authorities like EPAP to ensure populations received critical prescriptions, and will continue to coordinate on issues impacting long-term recovery. There's much work left to be done, but we have ensured the public health and medical requirements within the impacted communities are able to support the population. I thank you again for this opportunity to address these issues, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, sir. Colonel Heinzelman, you're up for 5 minutes, sir.
Sir, good morning. Chairman Farenthold and Ranking Member Plaskett. I'm honored to be here and pleased to testify alongside my fellow mission partners for the 2017 hurricane season. As U.S. Northcom's Defense Coordinating Officer for FEMA Region 2, I'm proud to represent the active duty soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines, activated reservists, and Department of Defense civilians who tirelessly supported the federal responses to both Hurricanes Irma and Maria in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The enormous damage caused by these storms required a significant interagency response led by FEMA and supported by a range of federal, state, and local partners, and U.S. Northcom was proud to be a part of that critical mission. As you are all well aware, the 2017 hurricane season was the most active in years, with 3 major storms impacting millions of Americans. In the immediate aftermath of those hurricanes, active duty personnel were honored to provide military unique capabilities to the FEMA-led federal response. Key contributions included strategic airlift, sea and airport surveys, search and rescue, route clearance, commodity distribution, rotary wing lift, high water vehicle support, and medical capabilities. The active duty men and women under U.S. Northcom direction made significant contributions to the response and recovery efforts in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I'm grateful for the support this committee has provided in support of the federal response, and I thank you again for giving me the opportunity to appear today, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Colonel Clark.
Good morning, Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Plaskett. I am honored to testify before you today to discuss the authorities and responsibility of the United States Army Corps of Engineers during a disaster response and recovery operations and the impacts to the U.S. Virgin Islands during the 2017 hurricane season. I am Colonel Robert Clark. I'm Commander for the Corps' Field Recovery Office in the U.S. Virgin Islands. My permanent position is I'm the Commander of the Corps' Wilmington, North Carolina District. The Corps conducts its emergency response activities under two basic authorities, the Stafford Act and under Public Law 8499. Under the Stafford Act, we are the federal agency in support of FEMA under the National Response Framework. In this capacity, the Corps is the lead federal agency for Emergency Support Function 3, Public Works and Engineering, and works under the FEMA's direction. ESF 3 provides temporary emergency power, temporary roofing, debris management, emergency infrastructure assessment, critical public facility restoration, temporary housing, demolition and structural stability, and support to FEMA command and control. Under Public Law 8499, we prepare for disasters through planning, coordination, and training with local, state, federal partners, and by assisting state and local entities in implementing advanced measures to prevent and reduce storm event damages. When a disaster occurs, Corps teams and other resources are mobilized from across the country to assist the local Corps district's response to an event. As part of this mission, the Corps has more than 50 specially trained response teams supported by emergency contracts to perform the wide range of public works and engineering support missions I just described. Additionally, the Corps uses pre-awarded contracts that can be quickly activated for missions such as temporary roofing, commodity distribution, and generator installations. With regard to the hurricane activities, 2017 was an unusually active season. The Corps has been involved in the FEMA-led federal response and recovery operations in support of multiple events to include Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. FEMA has identified close to $3 billion in mission assignments for the Corps to assist in Hurricanes Irma and Maria response and recovery. In the USVI, there have been 25 mission assignments totaling $256 million. For temporary emergency power, the Corps and its contractors completed 316 pre-installation inspections for temporary generators and installed 180 generators in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The Corps has de-installed 165 generators out of the 180 installed, with the remaining 15 installed generators that were turned over to FEMA Logistics, which are being maintained by a long-term contract. The Corps' temporary power mission was completed on February 11, 2018. For temporary roofing, in order for the Corps and its contracts to install temporary covering, the blue roofing, the government and its contractors require a valid right of entry. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Corps and its contractors completed 3,658 blue roof installations. The blue roof mission was completed on December 15, 2017. For debris management, the Corps and the territory combined has removed over 822,000 cubic yards of the estimated 870,000 cubic yards of debris in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The Corps remains fully committed and capable of executing its civil works activities across the nation, despite our heavy involvement in these ongoing response and recovery operations. We also remain ready and poised to assist in future events as they may occur. This concludes my testimony. I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoisier?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Chairman Farrenhold and Ranking Member Plaskett, thank you for your invitation to present the Department of the Interior's views regarding the impacts on the U.S. Virgin Islands from the historic 2017 hurricane season. I am accompanied by Daryl Eccles, who's in the audience, the Acting Superintendent of the Virgin Islands National Park. I'll summarize my remarks and ask that my full statement be included in the hearing record. Thank you. The National Park Service sites in the U.S. Virgin Islands include Christiansted National Historic Site, Buck Island Reef National Monument, and the Salt River Bay National Historic Park and Ecological Preserve on St. Croix, and the Virgin Islands National Park and the Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument at St. John. These national parks play an integral part of the tourism economy. Nearly 600,000 people visited the national parks in the Virgin Islands in 2016, supporting nearly 1,000 jobs and about $100 million in economic output. Hurricanes Irma and Maria significantly impacted the areas we manage. On St. John, the storms displaced a dozen staff members and destroyed or significantly damaged 25 facilities. The storms substantially eroded shoreline, deposited significant amounts of sediment and debris on the Virgin Islands National Park iconic coral reefs. These storms caused 90 vessels to wash aground or sink and destroyed strands of pillared coral, a threatened species. In addition, they substantially damaged the park's largest concession operations mainly at Cinnamon Bay as well as Keneal Bay Resort, the largest single employer on the island. Immediately following the hurricanes Irma and Maria, the National Park Service activated an incident command structure at all the national park sites within the Caribbean. The incident management team mobilized hotshot fire crews, units, and sawyers to remove debris from roads, parking lots, and walkways, completed initial building repairs, and restored operations where possible to help reinstate park visitation. To assist during the immediate aftermath, among other things, the National Park Service made the Visitor Center at the Virgin Islands National Park available to St. John residents as a temporary shelter, provided fuel to operate generators, and local health clinic, provided staging areas used by the U.S. Navy and BBC Electric, and provided radio and dispatch support to augment remaining emergency radio services, and helped ensure emergency services were available on the island. In turn, the National Park Service received tremendous support from other federal agencies, as well as the territorial government, nonprofit organizations, the business community, and of course our citizenry. On St. Croix, Christiansted National Historic Site resumed normal operations in November. The water and hiking trails of Buck Island Reef National Monument remain open to visitors, but the pier remains closed. The Salt River Bay Visitor Contact Station remains closed at this time. St. John Virgin Islands National Park reopened in early December, but is still in a major recovery phase. Initial repairs restored basic visitor services and reopened the park's visitor center, trails, beaches, and their adjacent waterways. However, much of the park's infrastructure, such as roads, water systems, signs, concessions facilities, and fee structures, were destroyed or badly damaged. Over 500 archaeological sites and historic structures still need stabilization, and 35 derelict vessels remain in sensitive habitat. Ongoing closures of Keneal Bay Resort has left indelible imprint on our visitor services and the community at large. The same holds true for park concessions operations throughout St. John. The National Park Service recognizes the importance of these businesses to the economy of the Virgin Islands and is dedicated to working with them to resume operations as soon as possible. The department appreciates the cooperation and collaboration with Delegate Plaskett and Governor Mapp, and we look forward to continuing these efforts throughout the recovery phase. Recovery of the Virgin Islands National Parks will be significantly spurred by funds from the Hurricane Supplemental Appropriations recently approved by Congress. The total amount of the recovery funding that has been allocated to the National Park Service for parks on the mainland and in the Caribbean is $207 million. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I would be pleased to answer any questions that you or Congresswoman Plaskett have.
Thank you very much. And it's Mr. Danka. Is that how do you pronounce your name?
Danka.
Danka. Okay. Mr. Danka, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Morning, Chairman Farrenhold, Ranking Member Plaskett. My name is Henry Danka, and I'm the manager of implant support for our Northeast area.
Could you pull that microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
All right.
Thank you.
In this role, I oversee the ongoing review and evaluation of service and quality performance at processing and distribution centers. I was personally deployed to the Caribbean for approximately 7 weeks after the storm. I appreciate the opportunity to provide the subcommittee information on the preparation, response, and recovery efforts the Postal Service employed in the Virgin Islands as results of Hurricanes Irma and Maria. In the event of a hurricane, the Postal Service's primary focus is the safety and well-being of our employees and customers and the integrity of the nation's mail system. We have an extensive hurricane preparedness guide to provide the necessary direction, coordination, and support to ensure we are prepared to respond to and recover from a hurricane. When we knew that the Virgin Islands were in the direct paths of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, employees were asked to confirm their contact information. All postal vehicles, facilities, and unprocessed and undelivered mail was secured to the fullest extent possible. We notified potentially impacted post offices to be prepared for closure. Emergency equipment was assessed for operability, and electronic equipment was powered down, disconnected, and moved to higher ground. Devastation in the Virgin Islands from back-to-back Category 5 hurricanes was like any experienced in recent history. We partnered with several federal agencies such as FEMA, FBI, Customs, HHS, DOD, and DEA in our response and recovery efforts. We confirmed the safety of our employees as quickly as we could and provided them aid such as water and meals ready to eat, which had been staged before the storms hit. Many postal facilities sustained significant damage. Despite our best efforts, we lost mail due to weather damage and looting that occurred before we were able to secure those facilities. Communication was sporadic, and we relied heavily on social media, traditional news outlets, and news outlets to communicate post office hours and service updates. Post offices were left without power and internet services for extended periods of time, which hampered our efforts to restore retail operations and track delivery of mail and packages. St. Thomas Airport was closed for 10 days following Hurricane Maria and later reopened with limited daily flights and operating hours, which remain in effect today. Also, the barge that carries mail from St. Thomas to St. John was down for approximately 2 weeks. Road closures and debris made it difficult for our employees on the Virgin Islands to get to work and deliver mail. Every postal facility in the Virgin Islands was damaged, obstructed, or impacted. The Frederiksted Post Office on St. Croix, in particular, was severely damaged. These challenges impacted mail delivery. Executives at the highest level of the organization were engaged with the recovery efforts, and the leadership team was deployed to the Virgin Islands over a 3-month period. We worked diligently to restore retail and delivery services where safe, despite stringent curfews. We reprogrammed equipment to pre-sort mail to help expedite delivery when it arrived in the Virgin Islands. We contracted with a commercial air carrier to transport oversized packages directly into St. Thomas. We used an expedited process to hire temporary employees to help with the backlog mail, and we installed satellite dishes to improve mail tracking and retail services. Currently, all post offices in the Virgin Islands are operational with the exception of Frederiksted. Repairs at Frederiksted and Veterans Station are on schedule for completion this summer. Also, last week, we sent review teams to every office in the Virgin Islands to assess staffing needs. We are grateful for the transportation and communication assistance provided by our federal partners. We are proud of our employees who work tirelessly to restore mail service in the Virgin Islands, many doing so while working to rebuild their homes and lives. While we recognize that challenges remain, we are committed to ensuring we fulfill our mandate to provide secure, efficient, and affordable mail service to all Virgin Island customers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome any questions that you and the subcommittee members may have.
All right, thank you very much. And I think we'll start with FEMA. So, Mr. Vogel, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes and want to talk a little bit about debris removal. We're 80 days away from a new hurricane season here. You've still got mounds of debris in various places, some of which are in pretty urban areas. My experience with hurricanes is you get all the loose stuff from outside and put it inside so it doesn't become projectiles. Is there some concern about a timeline for getting some of these debris piles removed before they become possible missiles in another hurricane?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we've been working real hard with the Army Corps of Engineers and the territory in order to be able to come up with a final resting place for the debris that's been collected. And just recently, the Army Corps of Engineers has asked for contracts in order to be able to have the debris removed from the islands, and we're awaiting information on that.
Oh, do you know where it's going to go yet?
That's in the process of being discussed, and the contractors have that option.
All right. Let's talk a little bit. A lot of the local witnesses talked about the interaction with FEMA at the hotel I was staying at the other night. There was a FEMA employee. I talked to him for about 10 or 15 minutes. And it seems like part of the issue is FEMA hires when it needs to hire. Obviously, you've got the need to staff up when they're big events. But somebody might get hired, and then when they're finished, they're laid off, and 6 months or a year later, there's a need again. You may get some of the same people back, or you may not, and there's a loss of institutional knowledge there. Have y'all thought about some way of preserving that institutional knowledge, or getting the training to new folks in a fast enough fashion where they can be of more service to the people faster?
Mr. Chairman, in any operation, we want to be able to provide the best service that we can for those that we support. We're always looking at ways to be able to train those people as efficiently as we can and deploy them to the areas where they need to work. Of course, as work is completed, those employees may go to other operations. Some may elect to leave. But we continue to work with everyone in order to be able to have some type of stability in our force. And I'm happy to say that we have hired 92 local hires here for this operation that will be able to remain working with FEMA as the recovery transpires.
And I think Ms. Plaskett and I are going to talk some to the FEMA folks in Washington about a program to train locals and come up with something similar to the reserves the police department has, or a National Guard that can be pulled. That really sounds like a good idea, that it would be a minimal investment that would pay big dividends. One of the other concerns was the fact that there's no local storage of blue roofs or water or food. Can you talk about why we don't have those more strategically placed?
Mr. Chairman, I know that the plan for the Caribbean was to provide those necessary commodities from the warehouse that was established in San Juan. I don't know that there is a facility in the Virgin Islands that would be able to properly store those necessary commodities in a climate-controlled area. But we'll certainly take a look and work with the territory to see
why would we need to air condition bottles of water and plastic tarps?
Well, the tarps will eventually deteriorate in the hot, humid warehouse environment. So, and water certainly has an expiration date on it, and we certainly wouldn't want to give any expired water to any survivors to use. So there's inventory control procedures that would have to be followed, and we'll work real hard with the territory in order to be able to see if we can help identify a system to make that happen.
I'm assuming you're not saying water expires, or there's probably contamination from the containers or something that makes.
Yes.
I mean, water's been around since the beginning of time.
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chairman. But I will say that the supply system, the logistics system, although taxed, did work very well in order to be able to get those essential commodities here on the islands for those survivors.
And also, let's talk for 1 second. I'll come back to it in my second round of questioning. We'll go ahead and let Ms. Plaskett go. Well, it's my 5 minutes. So, do you want to go? You want to go 10 and 10, and that might be a little bit more efficient? Okay. All right. So we're going to go 10 and 10. So give me 5 more, please. All right. So I'm just getting rolling. Thank you. So from a hurricane-prone area, myself just recovering from Harvey, and particularly in some of our coastal and resort communities like Port Aransas and Rockport in Texas, we've seen problems with the FEMA using up all the hotel rooms, whether it's for relief personnel, and that's not all FEMA, that's government-wide, as well as the linemen and all the other folks that come in. But we've still got, in Texas, we've still got several hundred people in hotels. And in an economy based on tourism, that's a problem. There was a witness previously that suggested that FEMA have the ability to bring in some sort of modular housing. I've visited some military and State Department facilities in places like Afghanistan, where a standard container unit is basically converted into a residence. It seems like something like that might be easy to transport and relieve some of the pressure on the local economy for housing relief and government personnel. Is that something y'all have tossed around?
Mr. Chairman, we're very concerned about the amount of space that we take when we come to any area that's been devastated by storms. This past storm, we had assistance in housing our staff and also linemen and other volunteer agencies on ships that were docked in Frederiksted and in Frederiksted and at Charlotte Amalie. And we had those ships with us until February, when there was sufficient housing that had been identified within the islands to be able to help support the economy and move our staff and the rest of the survivors into existing facilities that have been repaired.
And let's talk a little bit more about housing challenges for permanent residents. It seems like there's a delay, obviously, getting the housing back online. We talked some about insurance, and I think that's particularly true of owners of apartment complexes and other multifamily dwellings that rent things out. Do you see any way we can improve that? And so we've got places to put people other than hotels.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have the multifamily lease and repair program that's ongoing here in the islands, where we will pay a landowner to be able to, we will help repair the apartments that they have, and then as long as they're willing to accept one of our survivors, one of the survivors that we identify who needs housing, we will repair that, and then we will pay that property owner for 18 months while we're working on a permanent housing solution for that survivor.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Rahim, you say you're talking to the local officials on a daily basis in coordinating?
Yes, sir.
Is that by phone? Do you email? How do you talk to those guys?
It depends, obviously, on where I am at the moment. The times that I'm here, predominantly on St. Croix, because that's where the Joint Field Office is. Commissioner Davis, Deputy Commissioner Rubin, folks from Housing, Human Services, Vitima, et cetera, in face-to-face meetings. When I'm back in New York and doing the other things, it's obviously by phone, email, video conference, whatever's required, sir.
Well, this committee has requested from your agency copies of emails related to this disaster relief, and we've only got a handful. It seems like if y'all have the level of coordination that you're talking about, there ought to be more emails, and I'd like to request that you get with your IT folks and the other appropriate folks and see about getting our document production request met.
Certainly, sir.
We also heard from our local panel beforehand that there was an issue tracking victims who are medevaced out to Puerto Rico or wherever. What are y'all doing to improve the tracking of people so family members know where their relatives are, who's safe, who's not, and that sort of thing?
Mr. Chairman, so currently all of the folks are in Atlanta, Georgia. We've consolidated all the folks that have been evacuated from the various locations to Atlanta, Georgia, and all those records are made available on a daily basis. In fact, the Virgin Islands has very kindly provided 3 nurses, there's currently 2 remaining from St. Croix, that are actually acting as case managers to all those folks. So Virgin Islanders are directly speaking to other Virgin Islanders, discussing the needs and requirements. All those lists are available to the Virgin Islands Department of Health, and are made available on an actual daily basis. And anytime we return anyone, someone has met the needs of care and they return, actually 3 are being done this morning, those records are being done here. Obviously, that's after the fact. For this current season, if that need arises again, using established IT systems in conjunction and coordination with the VIDOH is a critical planning factor. Something called JPATS, the Joint Patient Assessment and Tracking System, is something we're working with the VA to bring here for this hurricane season. Clearly, in the last one, those evacuations occurred on a very emergent basis, and sometimes in those emergencies, and as you're well aware of from Texas and other things, those things don't always get all the detail collected at the moment. The detail was collected relatively quickly after the fact, but certainly there's always opportunities to improve.
Great. And I've still got some more for the right-hand side of the panel as I look at you guys, but we'll let Ms. Plaskett do 10 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time to do a second round.
Great. Thank you. I had some very specific questions that I wanted to ask very quickly, and hoping you can just quickly give me the answers so that we can cover a lot of material. Mr. Vogel, one of the questions that has arisen, and there seems to be some confusion about, in terms of Department of Education in the modular units that are going to be used. Recognizing that our children are back in school, we need to put on the record that the children are only in school in the public schools for 4 hours a day, because they are sharing space with other schools, because we don't have all of the facilities in place. When will the modular units that that have been discussed be on island for the next coming school year?
Delegate Plaskett, I can't tell you the exact date. I can tell you that we have been working very, very hard with the Department of Education and with the territory in order to be able to identify the number and type of...
So has that been done? Do you
Yes,
have the
that has
number?
been
Do you
done.
have the type?
That has been
Is there
done.
a person who has created them, and do we have a date of shipment?
We have let the contract is ready to be let. I don't know the date of shipment.
What do you mean?
We will get back
when you say
to
the contract has been ready to be led, does that mean it has been signed and it's in place?
Ma'am, I would have to check with the Department of Education.
So it's the Department of Education that's been responsible for that, not
Yes,
the
and
federal
we have been
government?
working with the Department of Education to assist them in identifying what it was that they needed.
So your position is more advisory in terms of what should be needed and what specs you all would be willing to support?
We'll support whatever specs they ask for, and what we do is work with them in order to be able to develop the project worksheet that will reimburse the territory for that process.
Got it. And now in terms of the hospitals as well, we've heard about evacuation of individuals. We know that dialysis units, as well as, people are really pretty much just being triaged at this point. If there's long-term care that's needed, they have to be removed. We've heard the governor talk about creating units on the ground as an assessment is done. Are those units on their way as well?
Yes, they are, and the units were delayed somewhat last week as a result of the storms, but the units are on their way.
And then in terms of the assessment, in the previous panel, there was a discussion about the assessments. Colonel Clark, I don't know if that's in your department with the Army Corps of Engineers. Has an assessment been made of the hospitals to determine whether it's 50% or more destruction, or when is that going to happen?
Ma'am, that assessment's ongoing.
Could you turn on your microphone, please, sir?
Yes, sir.
The
assessments are ongoing. I believe the actual assessments are complete, and right now they're working with the federal agencies and all the partners in completing that report. I think the draft report will be done in about 2 weeks, with the final report done by the 18th of April, ma'am.
And then that report goes to our governor and then goes to the federal partners in FEMA as well to make a determination of what reimbursement will take place?
Ma'am, we'll give that report to FEMA, and yes, I
so
believe that's where
you send
we'll
the
go.
report to FEMA, and then FEMA sends the report to the governor. Is that how that works?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Now, turning a question to the actual hurricanes and the recovery and the process. One of the things that I'm going on the ground is I'd like to focus a little attention on St. John. In particular on Coral Bay area, which was probably the most isolated area in the Virgin Islands after both of those hurricanes struck. I was struck by testimony from some of the witnesses who talked about the psychological feeling of waiting days and seeing the Navy and others circling, waiting for them to come on the ground after Irma, them being there and then them leaving again to move themselves out of the way of the storm, while Maria came and then waiting again. Could you explain that process? I think that would be you, Colonel Heinzelman, how that works and what is the protocol in the Virgin Islands for getting people on the ground, the military on the ground to support?
Sure. Delegate Plaskett, thank you for your question. So I think I would start with the National Response Framework. We respond to mission assignments that the lead federal agency, in this instance FEMA, asks us to do. And we do those in collaboration also with the territory. So wherever they ask us to do, that's where we put our capabilities.
And did you receive a request before the storms to be prepared to come?
Yes, ma'am. In fact, I think me and Mr. Vogel first spoke on Friday or Saturday, the 1st or 2nd of September. We did our first mission assignments, and it really allowed us to deploy the fleet. Maritime platforms. They take about 4 or 5 days to sail here, and that allowed us to have them offshore for when Irma hit the very next morning, the 7th of September. Myself, Mr. Vogel, the governor, the adjutant general were over here on St. Thomas within hours after the storm passing.
And how long did it take for all of the troops to actually be able to come on the ground?
So you've had a lot of talk about where you house responders and hotels. What we did is we berthed all our Marines and sailors on the ships. They came in every day. They performed their mission assignments. They went back to the ship at night where they slept and ate. Some stayed overnight. They would stay in the National Guard armories or near the points of distribution. But what we didn't want to be was a burden to anybody else. So they came and went every single day. The morning after the storm on the 7th of September, we had forces ashore. We immediately started doing medical evacuation. We did search and rescue. And we immediately started opening the roads.
So in the case of northern Florida, I know that the Army deployed troops to be in shelters before the storms took place. Had there been a discussion about having people in place in shelters before? If it was done, how many? If not, why was it not done?
So short of my team, which is about 26 people, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, we come down before the storm. We co-locate with the FEMA Incident Management Assistance Team at the Vaitema office, and I coordinate the response. Other than that, it's just me. Out in the ships, which were just offshore, we had, I think, 3,300 sailors and Marines ready to go.
And do you think that that was the proper mechanism for doing it rather than having individuals here staying in shelters on the ground? Was the ship a proper means with which to give the recovery, and why?
Yeah, ma'am, I think it's ideal because you can keep them out of the way. They can stay out of the storm so they don't become victims. And then immediately following the storm with their helicopters, I think we had 30-some helicopters, landing craft, we're able to quickly move them ashore. They're able to do their mission, but at the same time, they don't get in anybody's way. They don't take up the hotel rooms. They don't. There's not much room for, say, responder base camps here in the islands, so they can go back and forth to the ship. I think it's kind of an ideal way to do it.
And then one last question before I move on to someone else. In terms of communication, we know that communication systems were down, towers were down. Did you receive requests for, I think they're called cows or satellites or things, and how is that then deployed so that communication can occur?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, communication is definitely a challenge after the storm, as you know. We lost most of the cell phone towers. So I provided a lot of the communications. I supported both FEMA and Vaitema. Well, everything we have is satellite-based. We did that for several days until they were able to bring in more robust systems. One of the challenges, though, with satellite-based communications is you have to put up a dish antenna. And if you remember after Maria, the winds the next day, I think it was the 21st, were still like 70-knot winds. You really can't put a dish antenna up in that. So, we were out without communications for about 24 hours, and we knew that would be the case, and we went into that with what we called a no communications plan. Yeah. Would you like me to continue?
I think we should wait for just a minute.
We're certainly not in the dark on this issue, or are we?
What do they say? They're going to reboot the transmitter. Okay.
So until we get the lights back on or determine we're not going to be able to, we'll take a recess subject to recall of the chair. Sorry. The subcommittee will come back to order. It seems we've got enough power for our reporter to record what we're saying and keep the official record. We've got the windows open. We've got some daylight.